All right, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Kyle Rich, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about cultural safety and leadership in recreation and leisure. And I'm going to draw on some of my past work that I've done to illustrate how this applies and how we can think about ideas of culture and cultural safety in the context of recreation and leisure studies. So, in order to understand this story, I got to kind of take you back a little bit and introduce you to me in 2007. So in 2007, I had just finished my undergrad at the University of Ottawa, and reflecting back on it, then I had a specific kind of experience that kind of informed the way I saw the world and the way that I engaged in sport and recreation and what I thought or assumed to be normal ways of doing these things. So, for all of us, the way we see and understand our activities or think about why and how we participate in things is informed by our previous experiences and what we've learned in these contexts and other contexts. So, for me, I grew up in a small town in Northern Ontario with people of mostly a similar kind of cultural background, a very tight knit community with strong kind of community bonds where many people knew each other. But for me, going away to school, I moved to a big city, and then I started to learn about many of the kind of different types of diversity that there are in communities and the different types of people you work with in various community sport and recreation settings. And this was really a big kind of eye opening experience for me. So, as I take you through this presentation and we talk about some of these different ideas, I want you to think about where you're coming from, the position that you're coming from, and how your position has evolved as you have started to learn about different things. And then also think about how it can continue to evolve in the future. So, this is one way of kind of informing your reflection, right? Thinking about why we think the way we do, why we know what we do, and what we don't know, or what we don't fully understand or are able to empathize with. So, my objectives here are first to identify some of the changing characteristics in our contemporary social contexts. Second, to talk about culture and cultural safety and give some definitions for those. And then finally, discuss how we can apply cultural safety to the idea of leadership in recreation and leisure. So, I have a few guiding questions here for you to help you kind of think about how you can structure your notes and what you should be taking away from this. So, first, what is culture and why is it important with regard to leadership and recreation and leisure more broadly? What is the difference between equality, equity, and social justice? What are the characteristics of a cultural safety approach, and how is it different from cultural sensitivity or competency? And finally, what does cultural safety look like in the practice of leadership? So, to get us started, we need to consider that the world around us is changing and it changes very quickly. So, since the 90s, we've seen kind of increased both speed and rate of the exchange of people and flows of information. So, a process they call globalization, where much of the world is connected in ways that we never were before. So, in 1990, if you were sitting in a university classroom and you wanted to know what the weather was like in Australia, it would be a very long process for you to figure that out. There would be many steps. You would probably have to tap into some certain kind of database, or maybe you'd have to make a phone call or send a letter. Now, if I were to ask you that, you could all have that answer for me in less than 30 seconds, right? The way we are connected has changed drastically. And not only can you find information like that, you can also connect with the people who are experiencing those things. So you can not only find out what the weather is like in Australia, you could find out how that is affecting the people on the ground in Australia and what people are doing. And through social media, you can see what's happening there and how things are changing. On the other hand, we also have these higher or more pronounced flows of people and information. So what that means is we have kind of these emerging policies within our communities, within our states, and within our nations to address these changing groups of people. So policies which are apply across a range of fields, but we could say they're policies related to diversity and equity or cultural pluralism. And this comes in many forms. So in Canada, we have a national level multiculturalism policy that is intended to be a sweeping policy that applies to all federal government departments. But then we also have different policies right down at the community level, right? So things like offering gender segregated exercise times, or providing different kinds of supports in community centers to help support different types of people who come through our organizations. So these are both broad and specific issues that have implications on both ways as well. So in the context of sport and recreation, what this means is we have more different people who are coming together, communicating and interacting in these spaces. And these spaces are not only the physical spaces in our community, but also the virtual spaces online and these kind of virtual communities that we now see. There's changing demographics in virtually all public contexts. So we have more different people coming into communities, moving around communities, and that has wide-reaching implications. We're seeing different types of activities being offered based on what people are looking for in their communities. And more we're coming to realize that these one-size-fits-all leadership practices, so one way of looking at leadership and one way of being a positive influence on your community, is not really sufficient. So with diverse people means we need diverse leadership styles. We need leaders who look differently, act differently, and lead differently. And so this brings us into a discussion of this idea of equity. So I really like these diagrams because I think they do a really great job of illustrating some of these key terms that I think get thrown around a little bit, maybe without thinking exactly what we mean. So I want to review them here so we can really sharpen our language on this. So we probably have heard some of these terms before, so equality and equity, and this is a really important distinction to make. Equality means that everyone receives the same opportunity. So if we look at our little diagram, you see we have three people who are roughly the same height. They all get one box to help them watch the game. So they're all provided with the same opportunity. They all get the one box and the opportunity to see the game. However, when we look at the things that are around them, we see that there are structural things that are setting them up differently to have access to that opportunity. So we see the support that they're given initially, so the ground, the grass underneath, is that kind of initial support that they have. And then we can see the barriers that are constructed around them, so the fence. The fence represents these barriers that aren't the same for everyone. Some people have a little barriers or few barriers, and some people have more substantial barriers. In the next diagram, we have this representing equity. So the idea of equity is that people are provided what they need in order to have a more fair access to the activity. So what that means is someone with more barriers would then be provided with more support, or someone with less structural support could also be provided with some additional boost to see over the fence and see the game. So the idea with this is we do some redistribution, we provide different people with different amounts of support so that everyone has the same access. So to put this into kind of a clear example, we can apply this across many different kind of topics, but a really clear one that we can all think of is the idea of wearing glasses. If I was to hand everyone out a worksheet and say, you all need to complete this worksheet, but using all the same supports. So those of you who wear glasses, you're not allowed to wear glasses. You can't use contact lenses. This just has to be au naturel, only using what you have, no assistance. That's not really fair, right? Because you don't all have the same access. Some of you may not be able to read the words on the page. So the idea of glasses or vision assistance is something that we've come to normalize. It's a version of equity that we've come to see as something that everyone should have access to. Now, this seems like a really intuitive kind of discussion, but when I apply that to student loans and I talk about the government providing everyone with support in order to access education, because education fees, student fees, tuition is rising, those barriers are getting higher, and different people need different kinds of supports. All of a sudden, when it means spending tax money on these different kinds of supports, people get really kind of uptight about it or have different opinions. So it's important to recognize that although this seems kind of intuitive, it's not always picked up and accepted so widely. And then this is my kind of favorite part of the diagram. This refers to justice, so the idea of social justice. And what this is this infers that in order to achieve more just and equitable society, we need all the people with all the supports working together to dismantle the barriers and move around those different supports and raise those people who need supports up to be leaders within these social contexts. Now, unfortunately, social justice is more of an ideal than a reality, I think, but it's an important ideal to kind of articulate as something to work towards, right? We can work towards more just societies and more just social contexts. So now I want to flip a little bit and talk about this idea of culture. So another word that you've probably heard many times. So what I want you to do now, just take a second, pause this, and write down what you would say is your definition of culture. So just take a second, note that down, and then we'll see how they compare. Okay, so there's lots of ways that we can define culture based on your kind of theoretical or methodological orientation. I'm going to provide you with kind of a broad sweeping one here. So culture is the established systems of symbols, so things like language, art, technology, which reflect the traditions, values, and customs of an organization, a society, or a community. So understanding culture requires us to think really, really broadly. So one way of kind of putting it is anything that you learned socially rather than you inherited biologically is culture. So by that, within that vein, whether you tie your shoes with the bunny ears or with the big loop is a cultural thing, right? That is a system or a symbol. It's a way you do something. So that is part of your culture. Whereas the color of your hair is not a culture. Or to use the hair example, the color of your hair is not a cultural thing, but the way you wear it or the way you style it is. So it's important here to consider the kind of breadth of implications when we're talking about culture, and that different groups of people have different cultures. So as a family unit, you may have certain things that you practice, certain things that you do together, certain technologies that you use, and that is part of your culture within your family. On a bit bigger scale, an organization has a culture. So if any of you have ever worked for an organization, you'll know that working for one place is not the same as working for another. And some organizations do a lot of work to instill certain values and practices and language into their work and into their organization. So if you've ever called a Good Life, they answer the phone and say, "It's a great day at Good Life." And then they proceed to use the same kind of language and direct you in certain ways so that you feel like you're a part of that culture or like you want to be a part of that culture if they're trying to sell you a membership. This is all part of an organization's culture. And then at a broader level, we have kind of high culture. So the policies and social practices of a community or a state or an entire nation can be kind of articulated as culture as well. But I want to kind of direct your attention to the idea of recreation and leisure, and note that these activities are actually practices, right? These are social practices, what we do in our free time, how we engage with the people around us. These are learned socially. These are things that we learn socially. So recreation and leisure are cultural constructs. They are part of culture. And this is why we often see recreation departments, which are titled Recreation and Culture, or the Department of Sport, Recreation and Culture, because these are part of our culture and they're ways that we come together. So what's important to note here is that we often kind of tend to take that for granted. or we don't think of sport and recreation as a cultural thing or a cultural practice. And partially this is because the culture of organized sport, recreation, and leisure in Western countries, so European or colonial contexts, um, are quite similar. So these organizations or these activities can often be characterized by a culture of similarity. Which means if you go to a community center whether you go to a community center in St. Catharines, or you go to a community center in Burlington, or you go to a community center in Vancouver, there's probably a um, similar kind of practices, right? Similar activities. The spaces may look the same. The people may be trained in the same way to offer the same kind of programming, and this is kind of the way we tend to do things. And within these kind of understandings or assumptions, recreation is often associated with these positive outcomes. But what we tend to not kind of recognize or explore more fully is the way that these positive outcomes are often underpinned by ideas of productivity, right? So creating productive, smart, healthy individuals in our communities. And essentially, this is a product of capitalism, right? A product of the understanding that positive development for people in our communities will turn us into healthy adults who are able to work and contribute and make money. And this is really a product of these kind of broader Eurocentric or colonial discourses of society. So what we tend to kind of maybe not recognize is that this is a cultural practice, and the way we see this is part of our culture. And so, in order to kind of adapt or be more responsive to diverse recreation and leisures or diverse cultural practices in recreation and leisure settings, we need to really think clearly about what non-Eurocentric recreation and leisure might look like. What do these activities look like in diverse settings or for diverse people? So, to kind of highlight this idea of recreation and leisure as a cultural construct, I want to take you through a little activity. So, look at this, take a second, and write down what this is. It's a ball, but what kind of ball is it? What is it used for? Likely, most of you probably don't know, because if you've never had an experience with this kind of ball or playing the game that it's used for, you won't know what it is. That's because the ball is a cultural construct, right? The activity is a cultural construct. And if you've never been exposed to it or never learned about it, you really have no information to base this idea on. So this ball is for a game called CIRCA Takra. You can click on the link here to see what that looks like. Essentially, it's a type of volleyball, but you kick the ball instead of using your hands. And while most of us probably have never heard of it before, it's wildly popular in parts of Southeast Asia. So in some parts of the world, if you were to show them that ball, everyone would know what that is, and no one would hesitate to tell you. And so what I want to kind of highlight here is that our different experiences, the different kind of lenses that we bring to the world, the experiences that we've had shape our understandings and what we know, how we understand objects and activities. So this is another kind of fun little activity that I like to do to get us thinking about this and to highlighting the kind of multidimensional nature of culture. So I call this the power flower. Basically what you can do is you can go in, and in each of these circles you have an inner circle and an outer circle. And so what you do is you look at the category that's there, and then you identify whether you would identify with the dominant or the minority category within this. So for if we look at language, the kind of dominant category in our context would be English. You would color in the outside circle if you are a native English speaker. If you look at class group, the dominant kind of class group would be upper middle class. So if you come from an upper middle class background, you would color the outside loop. If you come from a lower class background, you would color the inside group. When you're looking at ability, right? If you don't identify as having a disability, you would color in the outer circle. If you do identify as having a disability, you would color the inner circle. And if you go all the way around that circle, then you get a kind of sense of where you fit in along all of these different axes and what that kind of lens that you're bringing to the world looks like. And it's really helpful because it helps us understand how for every person, we may have a different kind of lens that we're bringing, a different thing that we're looking at, a different way that we've learned about some of these different ideas and cultural constructs. So you can do that on your own, but just kind of a helpful thing to get us reflecting on some of these different axes of diversity. So now to kind of bring us into the last part of this, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of cultural safety. So you may have heard, you may have had training in cultural sensitivity, or you may have had cultural safety training as well. But it's kind of a rather new approach to thinking about diversity in a variety of contexts. So the original work on cultural safety was developed in the context of Maori nursing practice in New Zealand, so Indigenous nurses in New Zealand. And the idea was that cultural sensitivity and cultural competency training is really focused on the practitioner, right? So the person who is, whether it's a nurse or a doctor, often when we go through cultural sensitivity or cultural competency training, we are kind of focusing on that person and their individual skills or abilities. So cultural sensitivity being, I'm sensitive that there are differences. I'm aware that there are differences in the way people understand these practices or the way people do things. But recognizing that there are differences doesn't necessarily make you well equipped to working with diverse people. On the flip side, cultural competencies reflect this idea that I have the skills necessary to work in different contexts or communicate with people about different ideas. I may understand how I can do these things. But again, that's a focus on you as the practitioner. So cultural safety here departs from these kind of practitioner-centered ideas and recognizes that in all of these relationships and all of these practitioner activities, so practitioner-client or participant relationships, there is a power relationship there. So the practitioner has something to provide to the other people, and as such, they're in a powerful kind of relationship. So by moving to this idea of safety, we're recognizing that that's a two-way relationship and that the participant in these activities has the ability to feel safe or not feel safe. And whether the practitioner is sensitive or competent is kind of irrelevant to how that person feels in this space. So in order to kind of recognize this and work towards these more kind of safe feelings of safety, we need to kind of approach things in a few different ways. We need to, one, be critically aware of our assumptions and the intersections of our diverse cultural backgrounds. So being aware of the assumptions and biases that we bring to these relationships and how people might feel in that relationship or in the physical space that we're in, whether it's, whether it has anything to do with us or not. And we also have to recognize that the person we are working with, so the participant or the client, is the expert of their experiences. So they're the only ones who can actually recognize or affirm that they are feeling safe, right? I can't tell you that you're feeling safe. Only you can tell me that you're feeling safe. So this is the some of the kind of important tenets of cultural safety. So when we talk about this in the context of leadership, the work that I did, we looked at the Red Cross swim program. So this is a really interesting kind of example because it's a national program. The Red Cross swim program is offered in all the provinces and territories. Many of you have probably seen or interacted with Red Cross swim instructors at some point. Usually when we run this class face-to-face, there's a handful of instructors in the class. And this is an interesting program because it's run in many, many places. At one point it was the most popular recreation program in Canada, so in terms of just sheer number of people who register. And it's interesting because it kind of covers a lot of ideas. So it's a sport recreation, and water safety program. Ultimately, their goals are around reducing drowning, training people to be good swimmers, and to be safe in, on, and around the water. But this is interesting because swimming and being on the water is very much related to culture as well. There's lots of implications for culture on the water. So if you look at someone who comes from a place where there is not a lot of water, right? Not a lot of bodies of water, maybe lakes, rivers, or ponds. People approach water safety quite differently. So in Canada, we do have an abundance of bodies of water, and our general approach to water safety is everyone should know how to swim because there's a good chance that you will be near water and that you may fall in. And swimming is, in many ways, a kind of a life skill. But if you're from somewhere that doesn't have water, water safety may be characterized more by avoidance, right? So teaching us to stay away and to avoid that, because that makes more sense in that context. We also have many different kind of implications when we're talking about the recreation and leisure context of aquatics. So beliefs related to modesty and how we can engage in that activity in those spaces, or how and why we would use that space. So whether it's for exercise, whether it's for social practices, whether it's for just getting people together, whether we do it alone or in groups. And so what we found through this project that was really kind of interesting was that the way that we communicate in our system, in the kind of Eurocentric Red Cross system that we have set up, we really frame the messaging in a way that articulates that there is kind of a normal or a way that we should be doing this, right? And this is done through the language of what is right and wrong, what is safe and unsafe, what is healthy and unhealthy. And this is important because this has implications for the different people who are participating. So if a young person comes to a program and they have always been told that we should avoid the water, we should stay away, it's safe to stay away, this is how we do this. But then they come to the program and they're told that that is wrong, right? That their kind of practice that they've been brought up on and taught is wrong, or it's unhealthy, or it's abnormal. That kind of sets up an understanding of how they fit into the picture, right? How they fit in that space. Within this cultural practice, they sit outside of that. And so it's really important that we think about these kind of different ways of understanding these practices so that we can think about the way that we articulate it and that we communicate these things. So I have linked a video here that I think does a really good job of demonstrating a non kind of Eurocentric or Euro approach to water safety. So I'll let you watch it on your own, but if you click that, you'll see a video. It's called A Promise is a Promise. It's actually a Robert Munch book. Some of you may have been familiar with it. But the story there tells, it illustrates a way that narratives or stories can be used as a form of water safety. So I'll leave you to watch it, but essentially the story teaches young people to avoid going out on the sea ice because the sea ice isn't safe. So it's not a curriculum, it's not a set of skills and competencies that we need to demonstrate, but rather it's a narrative. It's a story that's passed down from one group to the next that does the effective job of keeping the idea of how to be safe in circulation within the culture. And so this is inspired from Inuit storytelling practices in the north. And it's a really great example of how there are different ways to approach water safety and different ways that we can approach these things and still effectively achieve the goals. So the Red Cross project was a really interesting project. If you're interested in it, feel free to reach out and I can share some more of the kind of outputs from it. And if any of you are interested in, getting involved in this kind of work, also please reach out. There's lots of stuff going on. There's lots of opportunities to get involved in research. So I would encourage you to reach out and ask about that and see what you might be able to get into as you move through your degree. But to kind of wrap up, I've got a few take homes and then a final reflection question for you. So, what are our kind of takeaways from this? How can we apply this stuff in our everyday practices or in our professional practice? So, in our professional work, we can think about how we can use reflective practice and engage in participant centered practices. So, in order to understand how people feel, we need to engage in dialogue. We need to understand how they feel and what they're bringing to the table. So, it's not a one way instructor or practitioner holding the knowledge and filling the receptacle that is the participant, right? It's a dialogue and a back and forth. We need to acknowledge that our actions and decisions are going to be understood and received differently by different people. And the only way we'll understand how things are received is by asking. We need to try to learn from the people in our programs and in our communities in order to understand how policies and programs can serve them and serve them well, and how they are experiencing their time in our programs and in these spaces. And I think most importantly is just kind of this take home of being humble, right? Acknowledging that you're not always the expert. Although you've been trained in a one kind of very specific way of being a leader and demonstrating your knowledge and expertise, that there are many ways of approaching that. And we're not always going to be the expert on everyone and everyone's experiences. So to kind of wrap up, I would say, as a reflection question, if you take one thing away, what is one thing that you could try to do to provide recreation and leisure opportunities in a way that is more culturally safe? What's a thing that you can kind of embed in your practice or in your day to day to help you think about leadership and think about different types of leadership and what that can look like for different people? So I'll also leave you here with a few references. If you're interested in reading more on this, you can look those up. And I'd be happy to field any questions if you have them. Hopefully you found this insightful, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in the future.